A Dog of Flanders. Chapter 14. A Cold Night. It was nearly 11 o'clock and more snow was falling. The trail of Nello's wooden shoes had been blotted out, and even his scent was not easy to find. After Patrash found it one time, he lost it. Then he found it again. The wind howled, drifts grew against the doors and curbs, and the roads were sheets of ice. The few street lamps had been blown out by the wind. All the cattle were in the barns, and warmth seemed to glow at the windows of even the humblest little cottage or hut as Christmas Day approached. Warmth was inside, but Patrash, old, famished, cold, and full of pain, was outside in the cruel cold. Nevertheless, love urged him on. He was determined to find Nello. The trail of Nello's steps, faint and obscure under the new snow, went straight across the village street to the old grey church. Had he been able to reason like a human, Patrash would have realised that Nello would most certainly go to the place that was almost as dear to him as the old hut. The church was not far from the mill house, but because so many guests and travellers had gone up and down the street and sidewalks, it took Patrash some time to follow his master's trail to the steps of the old grey church. The doors of the old church were never locked. Patrash had always been left outside when Nello came to church. He did not understand why he could not go into this building, but when his master made a request, he obeyed. Besides, it was not an unpleasant wait. He could hear singing and the sonorous voice of the pastor. There was a certain stern pleading, yet loving welcome in the tone of that voice. Nello and Patrash had been to the pastor's home, and there Patrash was allowed in the kitchen. It was a warm and welcome place. Tonight was different, though. The old dog must find his master. He nudged one side of the double door, and it quietly opened just a little. Patrash pushed through. Inside it was dark and nearly as cold as the outside, but at least he was out of the wind and falling snow. The fire in the stove that warmed the room had gone out long before, and the pastor had gone home to be with his family. In the dim light, Patrash could hardly see the white tracks of snow left by Nello's wooden shoes. He followed them to the front, and there, stretched out on the kneeling bench, was Nello. Patrash lightly padded to the boy and touched his nose against Nello's cheek as if to say, "Why did you leave me? Did you think I would not be faithful always? Have I done wrong in seeking to find you?" When Nello's cold hand reached out to him, a little murmur escaped the boy's lips. He drew the big old dog close to him. "No one on this earth cares about us," he sobbed to Patrash. "I did not know where else to go. I do not want to bother the pastor's family and spoil their Christmas Eve." In truth, the pastor would have welcomed Nello and Patrash had he known of their situation, but the cobbler who had driven them from their home had kept his cruel deed secret. Men do all kinds of heartless acts because of their greed and love of money. Patrash nuzzled as close to Nello as possible. He was content to be near his master again. The blasts that blew over the Flemish dikes and canals from the North Sea that night were like waves of ice that froze every living thing they touched. In the cold church, Nello and Patrash fell asleep. Together they dreamed of the happy days when they chased each other through the flowering grasses of the summer meadows, or hidden in the tall bulrushes by the water's side to watch the boats go seaward in the sun. They also remembered the day in the meadow behind the mill when Alois had made flower chains for their necks, and Nello had drawn the picture of Alois and Patrash on the piece of pine. "Oh God, how I wanted to be an artist for you," Nello whispered in his dream. "I wanted to use my gift to serve and honour you." The next morning dawned clear and full of sunshine, as it often does after a terrific winter storm. As he had promised, Mr. Cogges went to find Nello and Patrash at the hut. When he did not find them, he returned to town. Since the hut belonged to his friend, the cobbler, the miller stopped to ask if he knew anything about the boy and his dog. When the cobbler reported that he had taken back his property and turned them out, Mr. Cogges was horrified. You turned them out in this cold. Why didn't you say something to me? I would have taken them in." "You would have taken them into your house? Never," reminded the cobbler. "Have you forgotten all the rumours you have spread about the boy? I do not know where the two of them have gone, but I certainly thought of you, of all people, would approve of my collecting what was mine." The miller was nearly frantic. Where would a homeless boy and dog have found refuge on Christmas Eve in such a storm? "The church, of course," he shouted, suddenly full of inspiration. Perhaps he went to the church. No doubt he spent the night at the parsonage. He hurried down the village lanes to the old grey church. As he approached, he noticed faint dog tracks, those of a big, heavy dog, leading to the front door. At least Batrash had been there. As Mr. Cogges entered, the pastor met him. He was struck by the sadness on the pastor's face. The miller was nearly frantic as the minister pointed with outstretched arm toward the front and continued shaking his head. By now bright sunshine was beaming through the old stained glass windows. Light covered the scene, and there, with his head on the shaggy fur of his faithful companion, was Nello. A blanket covered them both. Mr. Cogges noticed that a fire burned in the stove, but the two figures were not moving. He immediately believed they were both dead, that they had come to the church the night before, and the bitter cold had claimed them. His jaw dropped helplessly. Before Mr. Cogges could say anything, the pastor spoke quietly. "It is so sad," he said, shaking his head again. "I suppose his grief and loneliness after losing his great-grandfather was too unbearable in the old hut. The two of them evidently came here to get out of the cold. If they had only come round to the parsonage, my wife and I would have gladly given them a warm place to sleep." "No, pastor, it's not your fault." Mr. Cogges looked at the two still bodies lying motionless at the front. His voice grew hoarse and louder. "It seems the cobbler put the boy and his dog out of their hut. Actually, it's my fault. I turned so many people against him." Mr. Cogges was totally overcome with despair, and his shoulders shook with sobs. Then, from the front came a sleepy moan. Startled, Mr. Cogges turned to look. The two bodies under the covers were moving. "They're alive!" exclaimed the miller. "Oh, yes, they're alive," said the pastor. He had not been startled when they awoke, as had the miller. "But I am certain they are extremely hungry. My wife is fixing them a hot Christmas breakfast in the parsonage kitchen. Oh, I'm so thankful they did not freeze to death sleeping this old church all night." As Mr. Cogges spoke these words, the pastor could hear the relief in his voice. "Yes, for some reason I felt compelled to check the church just after midnight," the pastor explained. "I found the two of them sleeping. It was so cold that I was afraid they would freeze to death. And since they seemed so exhausted, rather than rouse them, I just covered them with a woolen blanket and started a fire in the stove. They never moved." Shock over the near tragedy and the way Nello and Batrash had been put out of the hut quickly spread through the little village that bright Christmas day. News of the change in Mr. Cogges also spread. Although he was greatly responsible for all the misery caused to Nello and his family, the townspeople could not excuse themselves. They had listened to the rumours and had easily been swayed to follow Mr. Cogges's example. Responsibility lay at every doorstep. Had they all known of the sad conditions in which the old man, the boy, and the faithful dog were forced to live? But not one of them had lifted a hand to provide relief. Yes, they felt guilty, and rightly they should. For even at that time of year, when generosity overflowed to friends and relatives, not one had considered providing Nello with a hot meal. Every shopkeeper and merchant had seen the shabby, threadbare clothes Nello wore, yet they chose to ignore his need. Now they were ashamed of their selfishness. They had been concerned only with making their own lives more comfortable. They had turned their backs on responsibility and had forgotten God's commands to care for the poor and needy. To them, Nello, his great-grandfather, and especially the old useless dog, were someone else's responsibilities.